At Easter lunch, my daughter raised a glass and said, "Let's toast to the new owner of the house, my mother-in-law." Then handed me a box with my own keys inside. Everyone laughed. I simply said, "Open the garage before you leave." When they did, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. The smell of honey-glazed ham filled every corner of the dining room as I arranged the last of the Easter lilies in the center of the table. 43 years I've been hosting Easter lunch in this house, and I still felt that flutter of nervous excitement before everyone arrived. The china was my grandmother's, the tablecloth one I'd embroidered myself during those early years of marriage when Harold was working double shifts and I had endless evenings to fill. I stepped back to admire the table, running my fingers along the edge of the mahogany surface Harold had sanded and stained with his own hands back in 1982. Everything looked perfect, just like it always did. Just like Harold would have wanted it to. The doorbell rang, and I smoothed my navy dress before walking to answer it. Jessica stood on the porch with her husband Marcus and their 2 teenagers, all dressed in their Easter best. My daughter looked radiant at 42. Her blonde hair styled in a way that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. "Mom, you look wonderful," Jessica said, giving me a quick hug that felt somehow perfunctory. There was something different about her today. A kind of nervous energy that made her fidget with her purse strap. "Thank you, sweetheart. Come in, come in. The ham is almost ready." Marcus nodded politely but didn't quite meet my eyes. Even my grandchildren seemed subdued, which was unusual for Emma and Tyler. They were typically bouncing off the walls by now, asking when we could start the egg hunt. As I bustled around the kitchen, putting final touches on the side dishes, I noticed Marcus whispering something to Jessica. She shook her head quickly, then glanced toward me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It made my stomach tighten with unease. "Mom, we need to talk after lunch," Jessica said suddenly, appearing beside me at the stove. "Of course, darling. Is everything all right?" She hesitated. "We'll discuss it later. Let's just enjoy the meal first." The lunch progressed normally enough. We said grace, passed dishes around the table, and I listened to Emma tell me about her science project while Tyler showed me pictures on his phone of his baseball team. But underneath the familiar rhythm of family conversation, I sensed an undercurrent of tension. Marcus kept checking his watch. Jessica barely touched her food, and there were long pauses in the conversation that felt awkward rather than comfortable. After we finished the main course, I started to clear the plates, but Jessica stopped me. "Wait, Mom. Before dessert, we have something for you." My heart lifted a little. A gift? It had been so long since anyone had surprised me with anything special. Since Harold passed 2 years ago, holidays had felt somewhat hollow, maintained more out of habit than joy. Marcus disappeared for a moment and returned with a small wrapped box. It was heavier than I expected when Jessica placed it in my hands. "What's this about?" I asked, genuinely puzzled. Jessica stood up, raising her wine glass with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Let's toast to the new owner of the house," she announced, her voice carrying across the table. "My mother-in-law." The words hit me like cold water. I stared at her, not understanding. "What are you talking about, Jessica?" "Open the box, Mom." My fingers felt clumsy as I unwrapped the small package. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were my own house keys. The same keys I'd carried in my purse for over 4 decades. The brass was worn smooth from years of my touch. The keychain a faded photo of Harold and me from our 25th anniversary. "I don't understand," I whispered. Marcus cleared his throat. "Mrs. Patterson, we've transferred the deed of the house to my mother. We thought it would be better for everyone involved." The room started to spin. "You did what?" Jessica's voice took on that patronizing tone she used when she thought she was being reasonable. "Mom, you're 66 years old. This house is too big for you to maintain alone. Margaret has always loved this place, and she has the resources to properly care for it. You'll still live here, of course, but you won't have to worry about repairs, property taxes, all those stressful things." Without asking me? My voice came out as barely a whisper. "We did ask," Marcus interjected. "Remember when you signed those papers during your recovery from surgery? We explained everything then. But I didn't remember signing anything about transferring my house. I remembered signing insurance papers, medical documents, things Jessica had brought me when I was still groggy from medication and grief. Not this. Never this. Emma and Tyler were looking confused now, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. Emma reached over and patted my hand. It's okay, Grandma. Mom says you'll like having Margaret here to help you. Margaret. Marcus's mother had never hidden her disdain for me. From the moment Jessica introduced us, Margaret had made it clear she thought her son was marrying beneath his station. I was a bookkeeper's wife after all. She was a doctor's widow with money and social connections I'd never had. The papers are all legal, Marcus continued, his tone becoming more businesslike. My mother's lawyer handled everything. She'll be moving in next week. Jessica sat back down, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. Mom, I know this is a shock, but we're doing this because we love you. You've been so sad since Daddy died, and we thought having Margaret here would give you companionship. Companionship? From a woman who had spent 15 years barely tolerating my existence. I looked around the table at these people, my family, who had apparently discussed and decided my future without me. The dining room Harold and I had painted together, where I'd served thousands of meals, where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday dinners, was no longer mine. I need some air, I managed to say, standing on unsteady legs. Mom, wait, Jessica called, but I was already walking away. I stepped out onto the back porch, the same porch where Harold and I used to sit every evening after dinner, watching the sunset behind the oak tree he'd planted when Jessica was born. The keys were still clutched in my fist, cutting into my palm. How had this happened? How had I signed away my home, my security, everything Harold and I had built together without even realizing it? The surgery had been routine, a gallbladder removal that had left me weak and confused for several weeks. Jessica had been so helpful then, handling my bills, organizing my papers, making sure I had everything I needed. I heard footsteps behind me. Jessica had followed me outside. Mom, please don't be upset. This is going to be wonderful for you. Margaret has such great taste, and she's already talking about updating the kitchen and bathrooms. You'll love the improvements. Improvements to my house. Changes to the home Harold and I had carefully, lovingly created together. When? I asked without turning around. When what? When did I supposedly agree to this? Jessica's voice became defensive. You were having such a hard time after the surgery, and you kept saying you wished you didn't have to worry about the house anymore. We were just trying to help. By taking it away from me? By making sure you're taken care of. God, Mom. Why do you have to make everything so dramatic? I turned to face her then, seeing my daughter as if for the first time. When had she become this person? When had she decided that what was best for me was more important than what I wanted for myself? I want you to leave, I said quietly. Jessica blinked. What? I want you to take your family and leave my house. Mom, it's not your house anymore. That's what we've been trying to tell you. The casual cruelty of those words took my breath away. I walked back inside, past Marcus and the children, straight to the front door. I opened it wide and stood there, waiting. I think you should go. Marcus gathered their things quickly, avoiding eye contact. The children looked confused and upset. As they filed past me, Jessica stopped. Mom, I hope you'll come to your senses about this. We're trying to help you. I closed the door without responding. Alone in my kitchen, surrounded by the dishes from our Easter lunch, I sank into Harold's old chair at the breakfast nook. The keys lay on the table in front of me, catching the afternoon light streaming through the window. Then I remembered something Harold had said to me years ago, something about the garage that I'd almost forgotten. Something he'd made me promise never to tell anyone else about, not even Jessica. Maybe it was time to remember exactly what that promise had been. I spent the rest of Easter Sunday in a haze, moving through the familiar motions of cleaning up while my mind reeled from what had happened. Every dish I washed, every surface I wiped down, felt like I was caring for something that was no longer mine. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was cleaning up after the meal where my own daughter had announced she'd given my home away. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying Jessica's words, Marcus's businesslike tone, the way they'd all looked at me like I was a problem to be solved rather than a person to be consulted. At 3 a.m, I gave up on sleep and made myself a cup of tea, sitting at the kitchen table where Harold and I had shared so many quiet conversations over the years. It was there, in the pre-dawn darkness, that I began to piece together what had really happened during those weeks after my surgery. I'd been so vulnerable then. Grief still fresh from losing Harold, my body weak from the operation. Jessica had been attentive, almost aggressively helpful. She'd insisted on handling all my paperwork, organizing my files, even managing my checkbook for a while. "You don't need to worry about any of this," she'd said repeatedly. "Just focus on getting better." I trusted her completely. Why wouldn't I? She was my daughter, my only child. The idea that she would manipulate my condition to serve her own purposes never occurred to me. But now, sitting in the dark kitchen, I realized how calculated it had all been. The way she brought me documents to sign when I was still groggy from pain medication. The way she'd rushed me through explanations, saying things like, "It's just insurance paperwork," or, "Just updating your beneficiaries." I'd signed whatever she put in front of me because I trusted her, because I was tired and confused and grateful for her help. The phone rang at 8 in the morning. Jessica's name appeared on the caller ID. "Mom, I hope you've had time to think about this rationally," she said without preamble. "I know it was a shock yesterday, but you'll see that we made the right decision. Tell me exactly when I agreed to this, Jessica." There was a pause. "We went over this yesterday. You signed the papers during your recovery." "What papers specifically?" Another pause, longer this time. "Mom, you were very confused then. You kept saying you felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of the house. We were just acting on what you told us you wanted. I want to see those papers. Marcus has them with his lawyer." "Look, Mom, what's done is done. Margaret is already making arrangements to move in. She's very excited about fixing up the place." Fixing up the place. As if there was something wrong with it. "And where exactly am I supposed to live while Margaret is fixing up my home?" "It's not your home anymore," Jessica said, and I heard that edge in her voice, the one that appeared whenever she was challenged. "But of course you'll live there. Margaret is planning to convert the basement into a nice apartment for you. You'll have your own space, and she'll handle all the upkeep and expenses." The basement. They wanted me to live in my own basement while Harold's dream house was occupied by a woman who had never hidden her contempt for me. "I see," I said quietly. "Mom, please try to understand. We're doing this because we love you. You haven't been yourself since Daddy died, and we're worried about you living alone in such a big house." After I hung up, I sat staring at the phone for a long time. The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself, but the way Jessica had convinced herself she was doing something noble. In her mind, she was the dutiful daughter making difficult decisions for her aging mother's own good. I thought about Margaret then, really thought about her for the first time in years. She'd made her opinion of me clear from the beginning of Jessica and Marcus's relationship. At their wedding, she'd actually asked if I was sure I could afford my share of the reception costs. When Emma was born, she'd hired a private nurse without consulting anyone, as if she assumed I wouldn't be capable of helping care for my own grandchild. Margaret had money, connections, and a way of making everyone around her feel smaller. She'd been widowed young when her husband, a prominent surgeon, died in a car accident, leaving her with a substantial life insurance payout and investments that had grown over the years. She lived in a downtown penthouse, traveled frequently, and made sure everyone knew about both. But she'd always coveted this house. I'd noticed it over the years, the way she'd walk through the rooms during family gatherings, commenting on the crown molding Harold had installed himself, admiring the hardwood floors we'd refinished together, praising the garden I'd spent decades cultivating. Her compliments always felt more like appraisals. "You're so lucky to have found this place," she'd said once. "Houses like this don't come on the market very often. I've been looking for something similar for years." Now she had it. And Jessica had handed it to her. I spent the morning walking through each room, really looking at everything for what might be the last time as the owner. The living room where Harold had taught Jessica to play chess. The kitchen where I'd packed countless school lunches and helped with homework projects. The master bedroom where I'd nursed Harold through his final illness, where I'd held his hand as he slipped away. Every corner held memories, but it was more than sentimentality. This house represented security, independence, the life Harold and I had built together from nothing. We'd started with a small apartment and saved every penny for years to afford the down payment. Harold had worked weekends and evenings to pay off the mortgage early. We'd done most of the maintenance and improvements ourselves, learning as we went. It wasn't just a house. It was proof that we'd succeeded. that we'd created something lasting and valuable through our own efforts. And Jessica had given it away. By afternoon, I'd made up my mind to fight this, but I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. I called the law office Marcus had mentioned, claiming to be Jessica and asking for copies of the documents that had been filed. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Patterson," the secretary said. "Those documents are confidential. You'll need written authorization from the property owner to access them." The property owner? Margaret. That evening, I was in the kitchen making dinner for one when I heard a car in the driveway. Through the window, I saw Margaret's silver Mercedes pulling up. She sat behind the wheel for several minutes, and I could see her on her phone, probably talking to Jessica or Marcus. When she finally got out of the car, she walked slowly around the property, examining everything with the careful attention of someone taking inventory. She spent a long time looking at the garden, nodding with apparent approval. She walked the perimeter of the house, checking the condition of the siding and windows. She even opened the mailbox and peered inside. I watched from behind the curtains, feeling like a stranger spying on my own home. She knocked on the front door and I had no choice but to answer. "Hello, Pamela," she said, her smile as artificial as always. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I wanted to see the property now that it's officially mine." "Of course you did." She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her heels clicking on the hardwood floors Harold had installed. "The children told me you were upset yesterday. I do hope you'll come to see this as a positive change." "I'm sure you do." Margaret walked into the living room, running her hand along the mantelpiece. "I've always admired this space. It has such potential. I'm thinking of opening up this wall to create more flow with the dining room. And these old fixtures," she gestured at the chandelier Harold had surprised me with for our 25th anniversary, "will definitely need to be updated." Each word felt like a small knife wound. She was describing plans to gut everything Harold and I had loved about this house. "Where did you put my husband's things?" I asked suddenly. Margaret looked confused. "What things?" "His workshop in the garage. His tools, his projects." Jessica said nothing about what happened to his belongings. "Oh, I haven't been in the garage yet," Margaret said casually. "I assume Jessica cleared out anything important. I'll probably convert that space into something more useful. Maybe a home gym or an art studio." Something cold settled in my chest. "You haven't been in the garage?" "Not yet." "Why?" I managed to keep my voice steady. "No reason. I just wondered." After Margaret left, I sat on the porch until well after dark, thinking about Harold's workshop. He'd spent countless hours in there, tinkering with engines, building furniture, restoring things other people had given up on. It had been his sanctuary, the place he went when he needed to think or work through a problem. But there had been something else about that garage, something he'd made me promise to keep secret. Something I'd almost forgotten in my grief after his death. Harold had been a collector. Margaret moved in the following Tuesday. I watched from the kitchen window as the moving truck pulled into what used to be my driveway, followed by Margaret's Mercedes and a white van marked Prestige Interior Design. She'd wasted no time making her claim official. The movers worked efficiently, carrying in boxes labeled Master Bedroom and Main Living Areas. I noticed there were no boxes marked for the basement, the space that was supposedly being prepared for me. When I asked one of the movers about it, he looked confused. "Basement apartment? Lady, we weren't told about any basement work." Margaret appeared at my elbow as if she'd materialized from thin air. "Oh, that's phase 2, Pamela. First we need to get settled in properly, then we'll address your living situation." My living situation? As if I were a problem to be solved rather than someone who had lived here for over 4 decades. "In the meantime," Margaret continued, smoothing down her cream-colored blazer, "I thought you could stay in Jessica's old room. It'll be just like old times." Jessica's old room. The small bedroom at the back of the house that had been converted into my sewing room years ago. The room that was barely large enough for a twin bed and a dresser, with one tiny window that faced the neighbor's fence. That room is full of my sewing equipment and fabric storage. Well, you'll need to move all that to make room for your bed. I can't have craft supplies cluttering up the house. Craft supplies. She said it like I made pipe cleaner animals instead of the quilts and clothing alterations that had helped Harold and me make ends meet during the lean years. The interior designer was a young woman named Sophia, who spoke in breathless superlatives about everything she saw. "Oh my goodness, Margaret, this crown molding is absolutely divine. And these hardwood floors, they're going to be stunning once we refinish them. What's wrong with them as they are?" I asked. Sophia barely glanced at me. "Well, they're quite dated. We're thinking of something more contemporary. Maybe a gray wash to brighten everything up." Gray wash. Over the warm honey-colored oak Harold had spent months selecting and installing himself. "And this kitchen," Sophia continued, pulling out an iPad to show Margaret some photos, "has so much potential once we gut it and start fresh." Gut it? The kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals, where Jessica had done her homework at the breakfast nook, where Harold and I had shared our morning coffee and evening conversations for decades. "I think we should keep the breakfast nook," I said quietly. "It's been there since we built the addition." Margaret and Sophia exchanged a look. "Actually, Pamela, we're planning to remove that to make room for a proper island. Much more functional for entertaining." I wasn't aware we were entertaining. "Well, I am," Margaret said firmly. "I have a very active social life, and this house will finally be able to accommodate proper dinner parties." I excused myself before I said something I'd regret. In the sewing room that was apparently now my bedroom, I began the heartbreaking task of packing away my things. Each piece of fabric told a story. The blue cotton from Jessica's graduation dress, the burgundy velvet from the curtains I'd made for the living room, the scraps from countless quilts I'd sewn for family and friends over the years. As I worked, I could hear Margaret and Sophia discussing their plans. The chandelier in the dining room needed to go. The wallpaper in the powder room was hopelessly outdated. The whole house needed rewiring for modern lighting. They were erasing Harold and me, one renovation at a time. By evening, Margaret had established herself in the master bedroom. She'd had the movers rearrange everything, pushing Harold's old reading chair into the closet and replacing our wedding photo on the nightstand with a picture of herself at some charity gala. "I hope you don't mind," she said when I noticed, "but I needed to make the space my own. It's nothing personal." Nothing personal. Moving into my home, displacing my belongings, erasing my history was nothing personal. "Where would you like me to put these?" I asked, holding up the box containing Harold's clothes that the movers had unceremoniously removed from the dresser. Margaret barely looked up from unpacking her jewelry box. "Oh, just donate them somewhere. I'm sure Goodwill would appreciate them." Donate them. Harold's favorite sweater that he'd worn every Sunday for 15 years. His work shirts that still smelled faintly of the cologne I'd given him every Christmas. The suit he'd worn to Jessica's wedding. I'd prefer to keep them. Margaret sighed as if I were being unreasonable. "Pamela, we can't keep everything. You're going to need to learn to let go of things if this arrangement is going to work." This arrangement. She spoke as if we were roommates who had mutually agreed to live together, instead of what this really was, her taking over my home while I was relegated to whatever space she deemed appropriate. The next few days established a routine that made my new status crystal clear. Margaret rose early and expected breakfast ready when she came downstairs. She'd converted Harold's home office into what she called her morning room, where she read the newspaper and made phone calls to her various committees and social clubs. "Pamela," she'd call from her morning room, "could you bring me another cup of coffee? And perhaps some of those blueberry muffins you made yesterday." I wasn't her housekeeper, but somehow I'd been cast in that role anyway. When I tried to sit at the kitchen table to eat my own breakfast, Margaret would appear with a list of tasks. "I've noticed the baseboards in the living room need cleaning, and the windows are looking rather spotty. Oh, and my book club is meeting here on Thursday, so we'll need the house to look absolutely perfect." Her book club, meeting in my living room. The worst part was the way she'd redefined the spaces in the house. The living room was now the front parlor, and was off limits unless she had guests. The family room became her private sitting area, where she watched her programs and made her phone calls. Even the kitchen operated on her schedule now. "I prefer to have breakfast at 8 sharp, she informed me. "And I'll need the kitchen free from 11 to 1 for lunch preparation. I hope that won't be too inconvenient." Inconvenient? In my own kitchen? When Jessica called to check on how things were going, Margaret was quick to answer. "Oh, your mother is adjusting beautifully," she said, her voice carrying that syrupy sweetness she reserved for public consumption. We're getting along like old friends. Old friends. If Margaret's version of friendship involved treating someone like unpaid household help, then perhaps we were. See, Mom, Jessica said when she got on the phone. I told you this would work out perfectly. But it wasn't working out perfectly. I was becoming invisible in my own home, existing at the margins of a life that had once been mine. Margaret made decisions about everything from what temperature to keep the house to what plants could stay in the garden I'd spent decades cultivating. These roses are so overgrown, she announced one morning, looking out at the bushes Harold had planted for our 10th anniversary. I think we should just remove them and put in something more modern. Maybe some ornamental grasses. I bit my tongue so hard I tasted blood. It was during the second week of Margaret's residence that I realized she'd been going through my things. I'd noticed small items missing from the sewing room, things like scissors and measuring tapes, but I'd assumed they'd been misplaced during the move. Then I found her in the room, standing at Harold's old desk with my jewelry box open in front of her. "Oh, Pamela," she said without even looking embarrassed. "I was just checking to see if you had any valuables that should be properly secured. Some of these pieces look quite old." "They're mine." "Of course they are. I'm just concerned about insurance purposes. This house is my responsibility now, and I need to know what's in it." She was cataloging my possessions like a landlord conducting an inventory. The few pieces of jewelry I owned, most of them gifts from Harold, were being evaluated for their worth and risk. "I think it would be best if we put the more valuable items in my safe," Margaret continued. "Just to be careful. I prefer to keep my jewelry with me." Margaret's smile tightened. "Pamela, I'm trying to look out for your best interests. This room isn't very secure. And if something were to happen to these pieces, you'd never forgive yourself." That night, I lay in the narrow twin bed that had replaced my sewing table, staring at the ceiling and listening to Margaret moving around in the master bedroom directly above me. She was rearranging furniture, opening and closing drawers, making herself completely at home in the space Harold and I had shared for so many years. I thought about calling Jessica, demanding that she reverse this insane situation, but I knew it would be pointless. She'd made her choice, and she wasn't going to change her mind just because I was unhappy with the consequences. But as I lay there in the darkness, I remembered something else Harold had said to me once, something about the garage and what he kept there. Something he'd made me promise to keep secret, not because it was shameful, but because it was valuable beyond what anyone would expect. Maybe it was time to remember exactly what Harold had been hiding all these years. I waited until Margaret left for her weekly bridge game on Thursday afternoon. She'd made a point of telling me she wouldn't be back until after 6, giving me strict instructions about having dinner ready when she returned, as if I were her cook rather than the woman who'd lived in this house for over 4 decades. The moment her Mercedes disappeared down the street, I walked to the garage. Harold had always kept it locked, even when he was just running into the house for a glass of water. I teased him about it over the years, calling him paranoid, but he'd just smile and say some things were worth protecting. The key was where it had always been, on the hook inside the kitchen pantry behind the flour canister. Harold had shown me its location once, years ago, making me promise to remember but never to use it unless something happened to him. "What's in there that's so important?" I'd asked. "Insurance," he'd said cryptically. "Just in case we ever need it." The garage door opened with a creak that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet afternoon. Sunlight streamed through the dusty windows, illuminating what looked like Harold's workshop exactly as he'd left it 2 years ago. Workbench along one wall, pegboard with tools arranged in precise order, half-finished projects covered with drop cloths. But there was something else. Along the far wall, where I'd never paid much attention before, were shapes under heavy tarps. Large shapes. Car-sized shapes. My heart started beating faster as I approached the first covered form. The tarp was secured with bungee cords, professionally done to keep out dust and moisture. I worked to unfasten the cords, my fingers clumsy with anticipation and fear. When the tarp fell away, I nearly stumbled backward. A 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air sat before me, its red paint gleaming as if it had just rolled off the showroom floor. Chrome bumpers reflected the garage lights, and through the spotless windshield I could see red and white leather interior that looked absolutely perfect. Harold had restored classic cars. Harold, who drove a practical sedan and claimed he didn't understand why anyone would waste money on fancy vehicles, had been secretly restoring vintage automobiles. With shaking hands, I moved to the next covered shape. A 1965 Ford Mustang convertible, midnight blue with white racing stripes. The third tarp revealed a 1969 Dodge Charger, orange with black racing details that looked like something from a movie. There were 4 cars total, each one absolutely pristine, each one representing hundreds of hours of meticulous work. How had Harold managed this without my knowing? When had he worked on them? Where had he even found them? I walked around the Bel Air in amazement, running my fingers along the perfect paint job. On the workbench, I found a folder marked Projects, in Harold's careful handwriting. Inside were receipts, documentation, photos showing each car's condition when Harold had acquired it versus its current restored state. The receipts told the story. Harold had been buying these cars at estate sales, from classified ads, sometimes from junkyards, always paying cash amounts small enough that I hadn't noticed them missing from our account. A few hundred here, 1,000 there, spread out over many years. But it was the other papers that made me sink onto Harold's old work stool in shock. Appraisal documents. Current market valuations for restored classic automobiles. The Bel Air alone was worth $85,000 in its current condition. The Mustang, $92,000. The Charger, $78,000. The fourth car, a 1970 Plymouth Cuda that I hadn't fully uncovered yet, was appraised at $115,000. Harold had been sitting on nearly $400,000 worth of classic cars, and I'd never known. There was more. At the bottom of the folder, I found Harold's handwritten notes about his plans for each vehicle. He'd been documenting everything, tracking market values, even researching the best times to sell. One note was dated just 3 months before his heart attack. Pamela doesn't know about the collection yet. Want to surprise her when we retire. These should give us the security we need for our golden years. The house will be paid off, and with these cars we'll never have to worry about money. Our golden years. Harold had been planning to surprise me with financial security, a cushion that would let us enjoy our retirement without the constant worry about medical bills or home repairs that plague so many couples our age. He died before he could tell me. I sat in that garage for over an hour, looking through Harold's careful documentation and understanding for the first time the magnitude of what he'd accomplished. These weren't just restored cars. They were investments, works of art, proof of skills I'd never known my husband possessed. Harold had been a bookkeeper, methodical and careful with numbers. But he'd also been a craftsman, someone who could take something broken and discard it and transform it into something beautiful and valuable, just like he'd done with our life together. And now Jessica and Margaret had control of the property where these cars sat hidden. I thought about Margaret's casual comment about converting the garage into a home gym or art studio. She had no idea what she was planning to destroy. Neither did Jessica. They'd transferred ownership of the house without any thought to what Harold might have left behind. But they hadn't taken possession of the cars themselves. Harold had been careful about that. The vehicles were titled separately from the house, and according to his notes, they were all registered to a business name he'd created years ago, Patterson Classic Automotive. A business that, as his widow, I inherited automatically. The house might legally belong to Margaret now, but Harold's cars belonged to me. I carefully covered each vehicle again, making sure the tarps were secure. Then I took Harold's folder and locked the garage behind me, my mind racing with possibilities. Back in the house, I sat at the kitchen table with Harold's documentation spread out before me. The appraisals were recent, updated within the last year of his life. He'd been staying current with market values, tracking the appreciation of his investments. But there was something else I needed to understand. I pulled out my reading glasses and examined the business registration for Patterson Classic Automotive. Harold had filed the paperwork 7 years ago, listing me as the co-owner even though I'd never known the business existed. My cell phone rang. Jessica's name on the display. "Hi, Mom. How are things going with Margaret?" "Fine," I managed to say, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'm so glad. Marcus and I have been worried about you living alone in that big house. It's much better this way." "Jessica, I have a question about your father's things in the garage." "Oh, that." We cleaned out what looked important. Just some old tools and half-finished projects. Margaret said she might donate the tools to charity. Did you look at everything carefully? Mom, honestly, it was just a bunch of junk. Daddy always saved everything, you know that. We kept a few of his good tools, but the rest was just taking up space. Just taking up space. $400,000 worth of classic automobiles was just taking up space. What about the cars? There was a pause. What cars? The cars in the garage, Jessica. Your father's collection. Mom, there's just that old sedan of Daddy's. We're going to donate that too. It's not worth much, and none of us need another car. She didn't know. Jessica had walked through that garage, had supposedly cleaned it out, and she hadn't bothered to look under the tarps. She'd seen Harold's old daily driver and assumed that was all there was. I see, I said quietly. Is everything okay? You sound strange. I'm fine. Just tired. Well, get some rest. And Mom, please try to be patient with Margaret. She's doing her best to make this work for everyone. After Jessica hung up, I sat staring at the business registration in my hands. Patterson Classic Automotive. Harold had created something valuable, something that represented years of careful work and planning, and he'd made sure I was protected. The house might be gone, my security might be threatened, but Harold had left me something else. Something no one else knew about. Something that could change everything. I heard Margaret's car in the driveway and quickly gathered up Harold's papers, tucking them into my purse. By the time she walked through the front door, I was at the stove, stirring the pot of soup I'd prepared for her dinner. How was your bridge game? I asked. Wonderful. We're planning the most marvelous charity auction for next month. Margaret hung up her coat and settled at the kitchen table as if she owned the place, which of course she did. I was telling the ladies about this house, and they're all dying to see what I do with it. I'm sure they are. Oh, and Pamela, I've been thinking about the garage. That space is just wasted right now, and I'd like to convert it into something more useful. Maybe a workshop for my pottery classes. A workshop for her pottery classes, where Harold's life work sat hidden under protective tarps. That's an interesting idea, I said carefully. I'm going to have some contractors come look at it next week. The sooner we get started on improvements, the better. I ladled soup into her bowl, my hand steady despite the turmoil in my chest. Will you be getting estimates from multiple contractors? Of course. I always do my due diligence with home improvements. Due diligence. If only she knew what her due diligence was about to uncover. But I was beginning to form a plan. Margaret thought she'd taken everything from me, but she'd made one crucial mistake. She'd assumed that what she could see was all there was. Harold had taught me better than that. I had exactly 1 week before Margaret's contractors would discover Harold's collection. 1 week to execute a plan that had been forming in my mind since I'd found those appraisal documents. Harold had always said that timing was everything. Whether you were balancing books or rebuilding an engine. This time my timing had to be perfect. The first call I made was to Barrett Classic Cars, the dealership listed on Harold's most recent appraisal documents. When I explained that I was Harold Patterson's widow and had vehicles I needed to discuss, the owner, Michael Barrett, agreed to meet me immediately. Mrs. Patterson, I'm so sorry for your loss, Barrett said when I arrived at his showroom that afternoon. Your husband was one of the most knowledgeable collectors I've ever worked with. He had an incredible eye for potential. I'm only just discovering that, I admitted. I didn't know about the cars until this week. Barrett nodded knowingly. Harold mentioned that he was keeping the collection as a surprise. He was so proud of what he'd accomplished, but he wanted to wait until everything was perfect before he told you. Perfect. Harold had always been a perfectionist, whether he was balancing our checkbook to the penny or fixing a leaky faucet. Of course he would have wanted his car collection to be flawless before sharing it with me. I need to sell them, I said quietly. All 4 cars. Quickly. Barrett raised an eyebrows. That's unusual. These aren't the kind of vehicles people typically rush to market. Your husband's restorations are museum quality. With the right marketing, we could probably get even more than the current appraisals. How long would that take? For cars of this caliber? 6 months. Maybe a year to find the right buyers who'll pay premium prices. I shook my head. I need them sold within the week. Barrett studied my face for a moment, probably trying to understand why I was in such a hurry. Mrs. Patterson, is everything all right? If you're having financial difficulties, we might be able to work out some kind of consignment arrangement. Financial difficulties? If only he knew that my problem wasn't money but time. I have personal reasons for needing to move quickly, I said. What can you offer me for all 4 cars cash sale this week? Barrett was quiet for several minutes, making calculations on a pad of paper. Given the urgency and the fact that I'd be taking all 4 vehicles at once, I could offer you $280,000 for the lot. That's below market value, but it's cash, immediate and no complications. $280,000. Even at below market value, it was more money than I'd ever imagined having at one time. More importantly, it was mine, earned through Harold's careful work and planning, completely separate from anything Margaret or Jessica could touch. When can you pick them up? Tomorrow morning, if you can meet me at the property. I thought about Margaret's schedule. She had her weekly hair appointment on Friday mornings, followed by lunch with her garden club. She'd be gone from 9 until at least 10 o'clock, I said. That evening, I sat in my narrow bed in what used to be my sewing room, thinking about what I was about to do. Margaret was in the living room, entertaining her book club, their voices drifting up through the thin floor. They were discussing some novel about a woman who'd been betrayed by her family, and I almost laughed at the irony. The protagonist should have seen it coming, I heard Margaret say. There were signs everywhere that they were planning to cut her out. Signs everywhere. Yes, there had been signs that Jessica and Margaret were planning something. I just hadn't wanted to believe my own daughter would manipulate my grief and vulnerability to steal my home. But Harold had seen something coming too. Maybe not this specific situation, but he'd understood that life could be unpredictable, that security could disappear without warning. That's why he'd created his collection, his insurance policy, his way of protecting me even after he was gone. Friday morning came gray and drizzly. Margaret left for her hair appointment at exactly 8:45. Reminding me to vacuum the living room and dust the furniture while she was gone. As if I were her housekeeper rather than the woman who'd maintained this house for decades. Barrett arrived promptly at 10 with a large trailer and 2 assistants. I led them to the garage, my heart pounding as I unlocked the door. My God, Barrett breathed when he saw the cars. Harold outdid himself. These are even more beautiful than I remembered. His assistants began the careful process of loading each vehicle onto the trailer. The Bel Air went first, its red paint gleaming even in the dim garage light. Then the Mustang, the Charger, and finally the Cuda. Mrs. Patterson, Barrett said as he handed me a cashier's check. Are you absolutely sure about this? These cars were your husband's legacy. His legacy isn't the cars, I said quietly. It's what they represent. Security. Independence. The ability to take care of myself. Barrett nodded slowly. Harold would be proud of you. After they left, I stood in the empty garage for several minutes. Without the cars, it looked ordinary again, just a concrete space with workbenches and tools. But I knew what had been here, what Harold had created through years of patient, careful work. I had 4 hours before Margaret returned. 4 hours to set the second part of my plan in motion. The first stop was the bank, where I opened a new account and deposited Barrett's check. $280,000 in my name alone, in an account that neither Jessica nor Margaret knew existed. The second stop was at a real estate office 3 towns over, far enough away that no one in Margaret's social circle would hear about it immediately. I'm looking for a small house, I told the agent, an energetic woman named Linda. Something I can buy with cash, move into quickly. What's your budget? Under $200,000. I want something modest but well maintained. Maybe a cottage or a small ranch house. Linda's eyes lit up. Cash buyers were every real estate agent's dream. I have just the thing, she said, pulling up listings on her computer. There's a lovely cottage about 20 minutes from here. It's been on the market for 3 months, and the owners are motivated to sell. The cottage was perfect. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a small kitchen that opened onto a living room with a fireplace. The yard was tiny but well kept, with flower beds that reminded me of the garden I'd tended for so many years. The asking price is $165,000, Linda said. But I think they'd accept less for a cash offer. I'll offer $150,000 cash, 30-day closing. By the time Margaret returned from lunch, I was back in the kitchen, preparing her afternoon snack as if nothing had happened. She settled into her usual chair at the table, chatting about her garden club meeting and the plans they were making for the spring flower show. "Oh, and I've scheduled the contractor to come look at the garage on Monday," she said casually. "I'm so excited about converting that wasted space into something useful." "That sounds wonderful," I replied, refilling her coffee cup. The irony was almost too much. Margaret was planning to renovate a garage that no longer contained anything of value, while I was planning my escape with the proceeds from what she'd never known was there. Over the weekend, I began quietly packing. Not obvious things, not items Margaret would notice missing, just the personal belongings that mattered most to me. Harold's reading glasses, still in the drawer of the nightstand in the master bedroom. The wooden recipe box my mother had given me, filled with handwritten cards for all the family favorites. The photo albums I'd kept hidden in the sewing room closet. I packed slowly, carefully, hiding everything in boxes labeled seasonal decorations that I stored in the basement. Margaret never went down there. She considered it too dusty and unfinished for someone of her standards. On Sunday evening, Jessica called to check on how things were going. "Much better," I told her honestly. "I think I'm finally adjusting to the new situation." "Oh, Mom, I'm so relieved to hear that. Marcus and I were worried you'd never accept the change." "Accept the change? I was accepting it, just not in the way Jessica expected. Margaret seems very happy with her arrangements," I continued. "She is. She was just telling me about her plans for the garage. She's going to turn it into the most wonderful pottery studio. I'm sure she'll enjoy that." After hanging up, I sat at Harold's old desk in what used to be his office, now Margaret's morning room. I pulled out a sheet of paper and began writing. "Margaret," I wrote in my careful handwriting, "by the time you read this, I will be gone. I've decided to make a change in my living situation, effective immediately. You'll find my key on the kitchen counter. The house is yours to enjoy as you see fit. Please don't try to contact me. This decision is final and not open to discussion. Pamela." Short, simple, with no explanations or apologies. Margaret would understand that I was leaving, but she'd never understand how or why I'd been able to afford to go. I sealed the note in an envelope and set it aside. Tomorrow, when Margaret left for her weekly bridge game, I would take my boxes from the basement, load them into the car I'd secretly purchased that weekend, and disappear from the life they'd tried to force on me. Harold had given me one final gift, the means to escape on my own terms. I wouldn't waste it. The cottage was everything I'd hoped it would be. Sunlight streamed through clean windows onto hardwood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot. The kitchen was small but efficient, with white cabinets that reminded me of the first apartment Harold and I had shared when we were newlyweds. Most importantly, it was mine. Every square foot belonged to me alone. I'd been living there for 3 weeks when Jessica finally tracked me down. I was in the garden, planting tomatoes in the small plot behind the house, when I heard a car door slam in the driveway. Through the fence, I could see her BMW, and moments later, Jessica appeared at my back door. "Mom, what the hell do you think you're doing?" I didn't look up from my planting. "Hello, Jessica. I'm putting in a vegetable garden. Don't play games with me." You disappeared without a word, leaving Margaret completely shocked and upset. She found that cold little note you left, and now she's threatening to call the police. For what? I left her house key on the counter just as I said I would. Jessica walked closer, her heels sinking into the soft earth. "You can't just run away because you're having a tantrum about the living arrangements." Tantrum? My decision to refuse being treated like hired help in my own home was a tantrum. I stood up, brushing dirt from my hands. "I didn't run away, Jessica. I moved." "To where? How can you possibly afford this place?" There it was, the question I'd been expecting. Jessica couldn't understand how her poor, helpless mother had managed to buy a house and disappear without asking permission from anyone. "I had some savings you didn't know about." "What savings?" "Mom, I handled all your finances after Daddy died. There wasn't enough money for you to buy property." "You handled the finances you knew about," I corrected. "There were things your father left that you weren't aware of." Jessica's face went through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally anger. "What things?" "We went through everything in that house. If Daddy had left money somewhere, I would have found it. Would you have? I walked toward the back door, and Jessica followed me inside. The cottage was furnished simply but comfortably. I'd spent the past weeks creating a home that reflected my own taste instead of accommodating someone else's preferences. This is ridiculous, Jessica said, looking around the living room as if she could find fault with everything. Margaret has been beside herself. She's worried about you living alone, and frankly, so am I. Margaret is worried about me? I almost laughed. The woman who tried to turn me into her personal housekeeper is worried about my welfare? She was trying to help you adjust to your new circumstances. My new circumstances were created by you, Jessica, without my knowledge or consent. Jessica sat down heavily on my small couch, the fight going out of her suddenly. Mom, we thought we were doing the right thing. You seemed so lost after Daddy died, and the house was becoming too much for you to handle. The house was not too much for me. I'd been handling it perfectly well for over 40 years. But the expenses, the maintenance, all those responsibilities were mine to manage, just like they'd always been. We stared at each other across the small room. Jessica looked tired, older than her 42 years. I wondered if she was beginning to understand what she'd done, or if she was just frustrated that I wasn't playing the role she'd assigned to me. Margaret wants to know if you'll come back, Jessica said finally. No. Just like that? No discussion, no compromise. What would we discuss? Whether I should be grateful for being displaced in my own home. Whether I should appreciate being treated like a servant by a woman who spent 15 years looking down on me. Jessica was quiet for a long moment. She said the garage was empty when the contractors came to look at it. She thought there might have been tools or equipment she could donate. There it was. The question she'd been building up to. There were some things your father had stored there, I said carefully. I took care of them. What kind of things? Personal items. Nothing that would have interested Margaret. Jessica studied my face, looking for clues I wasn't going to give her. Mom, how did you pay for this house? I told you. I had savings you didn't know about. From where? From your father's planning. Harold was more careful about our financial security than any of you realized. It wasn't a lie. Harold had been planning for our security. He just used a method that none of them had bothered to investigate. Jessica stood up, walking to the window that looked out over my small front yard. Margaret is talking about selling the house. She says it's too big for just her, and maintaining it is more expensive than she expected. Now that was interesting. Margaret, who'd been so excited about hosting dinner parties and converting spaces to suit her needs, was finding the reality of homeownership more challenging than she'd anticipated. That's her decision to make, I said. It's her house now. She's asking $800,000 for it. $800,000. The house Harold and I had bought for $62,000 in 1979 was now worth more than 10 times what we'd paid. If Jessica had waited, if she'd let me live out my life there naturally, she might have inherited something substantial. Instead, she'd given it away to impress her mother-in-law. I hope she gets what she's asking for, I said. Jessica turned back to me, her expression puzzled. Aren't you angry? Don't you care that she's going to profit from selling your home? It's not my home anymore, Jessica. You made that very clear. But it should be yours. I'm starting to think we made a mistake. Starting to think. After living with the consequences of their decision for weeks, she was beginning to have doubts. Mistakes can sometimes be corrected, I said carefully. What do you mean? I mean Margaret doesn't have to be the one who profits from selling that house. Jessica sat back down, leaning forward with interest. What are you saying? I'm saying I have more resources than any of you realized. If Margaret wants to sell, I could make an offer. You'd buy back your own house? At fair market value, yes. Jessica's mouth opened and closed several times. Mom, where did this money come from? Does it matter? The question is whether Margaret would be willing to sell to me, instead of putting it on the open market. But why would you want to do that? After everything that's happened. I walked to the kitchen and put the kettle on for tea, taking my time to think about how to answer. Jessica followed me, waiting for an explanation that would make sense of this conversation. Because it's the right thing to do, I said finally. Margaret took the house believing she was getting something valuable. If I can afford to pay her what it's worth, then everyone gets what they wanted. What do you get out of it? Justice, I said quietly, and the satisfaction of knowing that your father's legacy is being honored the way he intended. Jessica called Margaret that evening, and by the next morning I had my answer. Margaret would sell me the house for $750,000, $25,000 below her asking price, with a quick closing. It was more than I had liquid after buying the cottage, but Harold's business records had shown me something else. Patterson Classic Automotive owned more than just the 4 cars I'd sold. Harold had been acquiring and storing automotive parts, engines, rare components that collectors needed for their own restorations. Barrett was delighted to buy the entire inventory for another $120,000. The closing took place on a Tuesday morning in May. Margaret signed the papers with barely concealed irritation, clearly annoyed that her plans for a lengthy sale process had been disrupted. Jessica sat beside her, still trying to understand how her financially dependent mother had managed to outmaneuver them all. When the paperwork was complete, I handed Margaret her check and accepted the deed to my house. "I hope you'll be very happy there," Margaret said stiffly. "I'm sure I will be," I replied. That afternoon, I stood in the driveway of the house Harold and I had built together, holding the keys in my hand just as I had on our first day as homeowners 43 years ago. The difference was that this time, the house was entirely mine. No mortgage, no shared ownership, no one who could take it away from me again. I let myself in through the front door and walked slowly through the rooms Margaret had been planning to renovate. She'd made some changes, moved furniture around, replaced a few light fixtures, but the bones of the house were still the same. The crown molding Harold had installed was still there. The hardwood floors we'd refinished together still gleamed. In the master bedroom, I opened the closet and found Harold's chair exactly where Margaret's movers had shoved it months ago. I pulled it out, positioned it by the window where Harold used to sit and read, and settled into its familiar embrace. From there, I could see the garden I'd planted, the oak tree Harold had put in when Jessica was born, the garage where he'd worked on his secret collection for so many years. Everything looked exactly as it should. My phone rang. Jessica's name on the display. "Mom, I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For not trusting you. For thinking you couldn't take care of yourself. For letting Margaret manipulate the situation. And for signing away my house without my permission?" A long pause. "Yes. For that too." I looked out at the oak tree, watching birds build a nest in its branches. "Jessica, your father spent 40 years teaching me that security doesn't come from other people's decisions. It comes from your own preparation and planning." "I didn't know about the cars, Mom. I swear I didn't know." "I know you didn't. But that's the point. You made decisions about my life without understanding what you were dealing with. You assumed I was helpless because I was grieving." "I'm sorry." "I know you are. Will you sell me the cottage?" I smiled even though she couldn't see me. "No, Jessica. I think I'll keep it as a weekend place. It's nice to have options." That evening I sat on the back porch with a glass of wine, watching the sunset behind the oak tree Harold had planted. The house was quiet around me, peaceful in a way it hadn't been in months. Harold had been right about insurance, about planning for the unexpected. But more than that, he'd been right about something else he used to say. The best revenge wasn't getting angry or getting even. The best revenge was living well on your own terms. I raised my glass in a silent toast to Harold, to his wisdom, and to the freedom he'd made possible. Then I went inside to my house, locked the door behind me, and began planning the rest of my life.